Hi, this is Kevin at the Virtual Planetarium at Raritan Valley Community College. Welcome to our weekly Star Talk. Today we're going to be taking a tour of our Milky Way galaxy. But before we do that, let's talk about our upcoming moon phases. We have a last quarter moon on July 31st. We have a new moon on August 7th, and then the first quarter moon is going to be on August 15th. Now, like I said, today we're going to be taking a tour of our Milky Way galaxy, but we're actually going to be taking a binocular tour. So I'm going to be showing you all objects that you can see with just a small pair of binoculars. It can be bird watching binoculars, or if you have bigger binoculars, then that's fine too. And they're actually objects that you can see even without a binocular and just your naked eye, but in order to be able to see them with just your eyes, you need to be in a darker location, so it might not be for everybody. But at least you can watch them with your binoculars wherever you are. Now, right now we're looking at our sky. We have it set up for about 10:30 at night, and we are facing south. So we have the S in front of us for south right here. And I'm going to put up a few constellations that'll help locate ourselves. We have the constellation over here on the left is the constellation of Scorpius. We talked about that in a previous video. The way to find this constellation is to find the bright star Antares over here. And then to the left of Scorpius, we have the constellation of Sagittarius. Now, in a previous video, I showed you how you can find the center of our Milky Way using the constellation of Scorpius. I'm going to link that video in the description so you can find it if you haven't yet. But just as a reminder, this very big nebulosity right here is our Milky Way galaxy, and it is right between, the center of our Milky Way galaxy is right in between the constellation of Scorpius and Sagittarius over here. Now, in that previous video, I mentioned that there's a lot of stuff in this part of the sky that if you point a pair of binoculars in here, you're probably going to see something cool. And I want to show you what I mean. Every single dot that comes up right now is a different deep sky object, and this is just a few of them. The first one we're going to look at is a little cluster of star called Ptolemy's cluster right here. We're going to zoom into it. Actually, before we do that, the way to find this cluster is to use the tail of Scorpius. So the scorpion hooks around a little bit like this, and then before it turns completely, if you follow these two stars here, you'll come to the cluster right here. Now, this one and the next object I'm going to show you are a little close to the horizon, so for us here in New Jersey, it might be a little hard to see if we don't have a completely clear view of the southern horizon. But they're still fairly easy to see if you have a pair of binoculars and you can see the southern horizon. Now, this first cluster, Ptolemy's cluster right here, if we center that and we zoom into it, this is what we call an open cluster of stars, and that means that it's just a group of stars that is loosely bound by gravity. Normally, they don't have a defined shape. They just depends on the cluster. It might have a different shape. This one right here doesn't have any particular shape as well, so we just call it Ptolemy's cluster after a Greek astronomer. Up here on the left, we have the name of the cluster, and then below it we have another number, a bunch of numbers, but the first one right here is M7. And this refers to the Messier Catalog, which I think we mentioned briefly in one of our previous videos, but I'll talk about it again. The Messier Catalog was this list of objects made by this French astronomer called Charles Messier, where he made a list of objects that are not comets in the sky. And this object right here, Ptolemy's cluster, is object number 7. There's 110 objects on this list, and we're only going to see like 4 today, don't worry. Now, just up and to the right of that cluster, we have another open cluster of stars. This one right here is called the Butterfly Cluster. And if we zoom into it a little more, you can kind of see why, but I'll help you out a little bit. This one right here is, again, another open cluster, but this one happens to look like a butterfly. So that's where it gets its name, the Butterfly Cluster, from. If you look at its name up on top again, you'll notice that it's called M6, and that is because it also belongs to the Messier Catalog of objects in the sky. Now, these next objects I'm going to find you can see them very easily from here in New Jersey because they're very high up in the sky, so they're easy to find. But we're actually going to be using the constellation of Sagittarius to find them. So Sagittarius is a fairly big constellation, but the easiest part of the constellation to find is the center part right here. This is what we call the Teapot, and because if you use your imagination, it kind of does look like a teapot. So we have the handle right here, and then we have the cover right here. and then we have the spout right over here. And then this is where the water goes. So it kind of does look like a teapot in the sky. Now, if you follow the cover of the teapot right here, and you follow these two stars in a straightish line, you would come to a fairly bright patch in the sky right here. And this is where we're going to point our binoculars next. So we're going to center that in our sky, and we'll zoom in a little bit. And this first bright patch we see right here that catches our eye is something called the Lagoon Nebula. The Lagoon Nebula is very big in the sky, and it's actually very easy to find. It's again something you can see with just your naked eyes if you're somewhere with not a lot of light pollution. And this is actually a star-forming region. So there's actually stars being born inside of this giant cloud in outer space. Because that's all a nebula is. It's just a giant cloud of dust and stuff in space. And then the stars that are being formed inside of it are actually glowing and making the nebula glow as well. So that's why we can see this cloud in space. Now, just above that, right up here, we have something called the Trifid Nebula. And this is something that, again, you can see in the same field of view if you use a small pair of binoculars. Right now, we're zoomed in about 7 times. And if you look just above the Lagoon Nebula, you're going to see another little small fuzzy patch of light that if you look very closely, you'll notice that it's divided in 3 parts. And that's why it's called the Trifid Nebula. This nebula is actually something really cool because it's a mix of a bunch of different things. There is an open cluster inside of it. There is a reflection nebula, which means that it's reflecting light from the stars, so that's why you can see it. There is an emission nebula, so that means that the nebula itself is glowing, so you can see that a little bit as well. But there's also something called a dark nebula, and that means that instead of seeing the nebula emit or reflect light, you're actually just seeing its silhouette, so it's not shining any light. And that dark part of the nebula is actually what's dividing it in 3 in this picture right here, so that's pretty cool. And then just above the Trifid Nebula, we have another open cluster of stars, and this is something called Webb's Cross. That if we look at it through the binoculars, you can't really tell the shape, but if we zoom into it a little bit here, we can kind of see that it kind of looks like a cross. I don't know where it got its name from, but you know. But again, all 3 of these objects are in the same view if you point at it with some binoculars in the sky. So that's pretty cool. And then if you move up along the Milky Way, so in this case it's up and a little bit to the left, you come to another fairly bright patch in the sky. This might be a little hard to see from light polluted areas, but if you point your binoculars towards this part of the sky, you're going to see a lot of stars as well, because this is something that's called the Small Sagittarius Star Cloud. So it's basically a really big cluster where you can see a lot of stars in there, which is pretty cool. But besides that, there's really nothing else going for it. But just above it, if we move up a little more, we have a very famous object in the sky. This right here is the Eagle Nebula. If you look at it through binoculars, it's not the easiest to see, but when you do see it, it's very cool because the silhouette cast right here by the nebula kind of looks like an eagle flying in the sky, so that's really neat. But another very famous thing about this constellation is this picture right here taken by the Hubble telescope. This is a picture of part of the nebula, the very center of the nebula, and you might recognize the name, the Pillars of Creation. This picture is called that because this region inside the nebula is actually forming new stars as well. And then it kind of looks like pillars, so pillars and creation. Thank you so much for joining us today. Hope you learned something new. If anything, you should definitely take your binoculars out and just point them anywhere in that southern part of the sky in between the constellation of Scorpius and Sagittarius, and odds are is you're going to find something very cool in that part of the sky. Hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please give us a like down below, and if you haven't yet, please subscribe to our channel because we are putting out a new video every week. And thanks for joining us this week, and hope you have a great one.